I'll now welcome our final speaker, Professor John Curtice, probably the best known media commentator, I guess, on polls and election outcomes, etc. I can remember seeing him when I was still a student. So I guess you've have a long and esteemed track record in not only in the media, of course, but also as a recognised academic expert on social attitudes, etc. And is indeed president of the British Polling Council. So please welcome John for the final talk tonight. Thank you.
Okay, self-confessed geek, self-confessed amateur psephologist, though somebody still keeps on paying me to do it, which is very nice of them, but anyway. What I want to talk about is something which is kind of one of the presumptions that was often existing at the backdrop of the referendum campaign. Indeed, it's often a backdrop to conversations in Scotland about politics and its constitutional future, etc. And that is to examine the question of whether or not indeed political attitudes, social attitudes, and therefore policy preferences in Scotland really are different from those south of the border. There are some fairly common assumptions that are made about political discourse in Scotland. Number one is that Scotland is rather more egalitarian in its outlook. The second is that it's rather more sympathetic to the welfare state, particularly the payment of cash welfare benefits. It's certainly often argued that it's less keen on privatisation. It wants its public services to be delivered by the public sector, and it believes that those services should be free and universal at the point of delivery. Those three things, of course, are often thought to go together. Support for the welfare state, being rather more egalitarian, being interested in having a relatively strong state public sector. What's also argued, which is arguably something a little bit different, is that Scotland is also, and I'm going to use this word very liberally in terms of its meaning, but is rather more liberal in its outlook towards the rest of the world, rather more outgoing. Now, these arguments that are often made, and these arguments were certainly particularly often made by those who are campaigning in favour of a yes vote, arguing that indeed, looking at one of the reasons as to why it's difficult for Scotland to remain inside the United Kingdom is that the public preferences of people in Scotland are indeed very different from those of the rest of the United Kingdom, and therefore, given Scotland's relative size within the UK, there was always a substantial risk that public preferences in Scotland would be overturned by those in the rest of the United Kingdom, certainly for so long as the United Kingdom was responsible for large sectors of domestic policy, and arguably, so far as the last of the items I'm going to talk about, also true of foreign and defence policy as well. It's very obvious to see why people make this assumption. You look at the politics of Scotland, and you discover a society in which its political competition these days is political competition between two political parties, both of whom claim to be social democratic. The principal party of the centre-right in the United Kingdom has long been a third-party, relatively minor player. And then, of course, more recently, we have seen the rise of an even further party, even further to the right, the United Kingdom Independence Party in England in the last 2 or 3 years. Yet, although that party did manage to get one representative in the European Parliament in Scotland, it's clearly much weaker north of the border than it is south of the border. So arguably politics, party politics in Scotland, has never been more different from that of the rest of the United Kingdom. And if the ballot box therefore reflects anything, surely it's going to be extremely difficult for me to prove the validity of those statements. Well, let's have a look. I'm going to look at it by not trying to infer people's attitudes from the way in which they vote, always a very dangerous enterprise, but actually to try to look at see what survey data says us about what are people's views. And I'm going to take some survey data where it's actually possible to systematically compare attitudes in Scotland with those south of the border, or in some cases across the UK as a whole, using 2 surveys conducted in pretty much exactly the same manner, using exactly the same method, and therefore we can reasonably assume that whatever differences that we uncover are not the product of methodological differences, differences in the way in which the surveys have been conducted on the two sides of the border, but actually reflect real differences in the distribution of attitudes in their respective populations. These data come from the Scottish and British social attitude surveys. AQMeN has been very supportive of Scottish social attitudes in particular in recent years, and indeed actually the early days of Scottish social attitudes is an enterprise in which Lindsay Patterson in particular was very heavily involved, and he's been a long supporter all the way throughout. So this is very much work that folk from AQMeN have been very much important in producing. British social attitudes goes back rather longer. It goes back to 1983, but of course I'm going to be looking at the data from the 1990s onwards for this purpose. They're both annual, high-quality, face-to-face probability surveys. None of you YouGov stuff here, none of this, volunteers over the internet. These are folk who have been selected at random, and the poor interviewer has to persuade and cajole them to take part because they cannot take anybody else. And typically each year, they're annual surveys. We've got 1,500 people interviewed in Scotland and around 3,000 in the British survey across the UK as a whole. Okay, so let me take proposition number one. Scotland is more egalitarian in its values than is the rest of the UK. One suite of questions that Scottish and British social attitudes actually pretty much both ask every single year is a set of items that were developed in the 1980s, where the aim was to try and get at what are the values that lie at the heart of the divide between left and right in British politics. So it's essentially a divide about the degree to which you think there's inequality in our society and how much you think the state should do something about it. And I'm showing you there the 5 items that are asked regularly on the surveys in order to try and tap that dimension. And I'm going to show you the results of a couple of the individual ones and then show you the summary results. So here's exhibit number 1. This is the item in which we ask people about whether or not ordinary working people do not get their fair share of the nation's worth, and this is showing you the proportion of people who agree or disagree. And I think I've got it all right, though I give a prize to the person who spots it when I've got it all the way around, but usually blue is Scotland and red is England. I've tried to make it easy for you, okay? And as you can see, Scotland, typically from year to year, there are slightly more people who say, yeah, you know what, life's unfair, life sucks. Our society is rather more unequal for my taste. But it's not dramatic. It's marginal. It's nothing like the difference between the level of support between the Conservatives, north and south of the border, which is what people usually rely on. Arguably more important, however, is not just simply what people think the position is, but what they think should be done about it. And here you do get something more of a difference, although it's not always been consistent over time. Indeed, in the early years of the 21st century, there were some signs that Scotland was in fact moving to the right, perhaps also catching up with a much longer-term trend that is certainly evident in the 1990s across the UK as a whole. It's gone back up again. So Scotland certainly is rather more willing, certainly to see the state do something about redistribution. A bit more than marginally here, but not obviously looking at a society whose overall value preferences are wildly at variance with those south of the border. And we get much the same picture with one particular dip. If we actually take all those 5 items I showed you earlier, put them together, turn them into a scale, and just come up with a single summary measure, a simple average. And on this measure, the lower the score, the more left-wing you are. So in each and every year, pretty much, Scotland ends up looking a bit more to the left, a bit more egalitarian, more concerned about inequality than is England, although, as you can see, it bounces around from year to year, but it's not dramatic. It's a question of degree, not a question of a different kind of society. Okay, number 1, we're a bit more egalitarian, but not dramatically. What about welfare? A lot of the debate in the referendum was about the iniquities of some of the welfare reform that are being undertaken by the UK coalition and why this offended Scots' sensibilities. Okay. Well, first thing perhaps to appreciate is that we do in Scotland make much the same distinction as England does between those whom we consider to be deserving of welfare and those perhaps who are rather less deserving. This is a very simple item in which we simply say to people, do you think the government should spend more or less on benefits of people with disabilities, people who are retired, and people who are unemployed? Now, again, in both cases, Scotland's a bit more sympathetic, willing to pay a little bit more. But boy, oh boy, we're not so keen on the unemployed either. And to that extent, at least the structure of public opinion in Scotland, the pattern of public opinion in Scotland, the distinctions that we make are not dissimilar to those to be found south of the border. Second thing we can look at is a very generic thing. This is a survey item, again, which we keep on asking people year after year. And arguably, the financial crisis has slightly overtaken it, but it's still worth asking. And we simply say to people, look, suppose the government had to choose. Should it spend more on public services like health and education and put up taxes to fund it? Should it keep things, as far as taxation and public services are concerned, pretty much as they are? Or should we cut public services and cut taxation as well? And what I'm showing you here is simply for both Scotland and for England, the percentage of people who say we should increase spending and we should increase taxation in order to fund it. Now, what you will see are two things. First is, yeah, in most years, Scotland's a bit more willing to say, yeah, we should spend more and be willing to pay more taxes. Fine. But what you will also notice is that Scotland has moved in pretty much in parallel with England. And that in the first decade of the 21st century, Scotland became less keen on tax and spend, pretty much the same way that England became less keen on tax and spend. Now, this is not terribly surprising, because actually what happened in the first decade of the 21st century was one of the biggest increases in public spending in post-war history. New Labour, which came to power saying we will keep to the Tories' promises, as soon as they'd kept them, then went on something of a spending spree. And we know from lots of wider other research evidence that basically what tends to happen, because it's impossible to satisfy public opinion on this issue. If you increase public spending and increases taxation, the reaction of the public after a while is, oh, that's fine, thanks very much. Our public services are now wonderful. Could you now please reduce our taxes? And then we said about reducing their taxes, and then they say, oh dear, well, it's nice to have a few pounds in our pocket, but I'm now having to wait too long for my hospital operation. Could you now please reverse policy and increase spending, and I'm willing to spend more for it? You know, such is life. But we've been through one of those phases where public spending was increased, but Scotland has reacted in exactly the same way as England has to that, and we're not so keen on tax and spend as we once were. A second very substantial trend that's been evident across the UK in recent years, and to which our politicians south of the border at least have certainly been responding, is that we've become rather less keen on welfare. Here's one example. This is simply an item in which it says which people say, it's actually giving people the rather more liberal response, and it says, do you think that there are lots of people who fail to claim the benefits to which they are entitled? Scotland tends to be a little more likely to agree with that in any one year, but you can see that Scotland has become less sympathetic to that idea over the years, very much in parallel with England. Scotland may have its own public discourse, but when it comes to trends over time and changes over time, and although Scotland may continue to remain a little more liberal on welfare at any one point in time, it actually seems to move surprisingly similarly and in parallel with public opinion in England, despite the advent of devolution and that separate discourse. Again, similar pattern, people's attitudes towards unemployment benefit. Do we think that unemployment benefit is too high and puts people off trying to find work versus thinking it's too low and causes hardship? This is the percentage who think it's too high. And again, Scotland tends to be more liberal. It's less likely to think it's too high at any one point in time, but it has moved in much the same direction as the rest of the United Kingdom has. And to that extent, at least now, the views north of the border towards welfare are not as liberal as they were 10 or so years ago. And an independent Scotland, therefore, may not have necessarily been as particularly a pro-welfare society as many seem to presume. Now, what about the delivery of public services? And again, I'm using privatisation in a very loose sense, in the loose sense in which it is very commonly used in our public discourse. I'm going to include not just the actual use of private services, the private sector to deliver public services, but also whether or not people should be paying. Because certainly one of the distinctive policies that has emerged out of devolution, one of the ways in which Scotland has differentiated itself from England so far as public policy is concerned, has been in certain aspects of the free, quote-unquote, delivery of public services. Two obvious examples. One is the free personal care for older people, and the second is free university tuition, something which the SNP at least believe is central to the delivery of a social democratic society and is a reflection of social democratic values, although, of course, there are others on the left of a social democratic disposition who would not necessarily agree that that approach to delivering public services is necessarily the best way of achieving more equal or satisfactory outcomes. I don't want to go into that debate. I simply note that there are arguments on both sides. Okay. This is an item we've asked on Scottish social attitudes. I'm showing you Scotland, first of all, first here, in which we said to people, you know what, how do you think the care that older people might need should be paid for? Should the government pay, no matter what income people have? Should the person pay, irrespective of their income? And that's the red line at the bottom. None of us think that, everybody should have to pay. But the green line's the interesting one. The person should pay depending on how much income they have. Now, it is true in the early years of free personal care, there was a small majority in Scotland in favour, but it's not an overwhelming majority. Scotland was marginally in favour of free personal care as opposed to at least charging some people. But you will note that the popularity of that policy has declined over time. And in fact, on the most recent reading in 2013, we had slightly more people in Scotland saying that actually maybe some people should have to pay. And in that, again, the trend is extraordinarily similar to what we see south of the border. Now, again, from the starting point, we discover that indeed back in 2005, a majority of people in England were marginally against free personal care. So the policy difference did indeed reflect different majority opinions, although in both countries, the majority was a fairly thin one. But you will notice that in England, the idea of free personal care has become less popular, even though politicians south of the border are moving at least somewhat closer in that direction, at least in terms of aspiration, if not necessarily in terms of delivery. And then therefore, in fact, the move in Scotland away from support from free personal care actually reflects, again, a similar trend south of the border. And it's a not dissimilar, if rather more dramatic story when it comes to the principle of free university tuition, which, as Lindsay Patterson told the politicians back when it was introduced, or at least the graduate endowment was first introduced, actually, you know what, it's not that popular a policy in Scotland. Even back in 2000, only 38% of people said, look, absolutely no students at all should have to pay tuition. And you will see it's gone down over time. It's gone down over time in much the same way on both sides of the border. And so we see on both of those signature policies, free personal care and free tuition fees, actually these things have become less popular. Now, if you dig into this a bit further, what you can also show is that 9,000 quid was just simply too high. Right? 9,000 quid fees are unpopular, but 3,000, 4,000, I can find you other survey evidence which suggests that the majority of people in Scotland will be willing to tolerate such an idea. Okay, what about now more clearly about privatisation, about the delivery of public services? Something which, again, a very marked difference is the way in which the Scottish government both the previous regime and the current one are very reluctant to use the private sector in order to deliver public services, whereas in England there has been a rather greater use of that, something that indeed, again, both Labour and Conservative UK governments have promoted. Is this something on which we have different views? Well, actually, no. Actually, yeah, the SNP's got this one absolutely right. People in Scotland are not terribly keen on the idea of private companies running hospitals, but neither are people in England. The privatisation agenda is being pursued south of the border despite the fact that public opinion is rather queasy about the idea of allowing the public sector to deliver public services. It is not a reflection of a difference. Now, it's true people in England are slightly more tolerant. Again, you've got used to this pattern, but it's not that different. And you'll notice there certainly isn't any evidence here of privatisation becoming more popular on either side of the border over time. We're a bit more well-disposed to the idea of third sector organisations being involved in the running of hospitals, but again, even here, it's not something we're wild about. Again, private companies running schools, something which now is effectively happening south of the border. It's happening south of the border despite rather than because of public opinion, and the same is also largely true of charities. So again, Scotland and England, a little different, but in fact, when it comes to majority views, extraordinarily similar to each other. Now, that's not to deny that there aren't some differences, and I owe this point entirely to Lindsay Patterson, but I just couldn't avoid it. There are a few things on which you really can find differences of attitude between Scotland and England. One obvious one is national identity. I mean, national identity in Scotland is just completely different from that in England. But a second one does indeed come from education, and it relates, therefore, to the delivery of the delivery of public services. And that is the idea of whether or not you should have what we used to call the 11+, and the 11+ still exists in parts of England. And here is something, it hasn't really changed over time. It's extraordinarly consistent. But if you ask people on the two sides of the border, what should happen to people at age 11? Which school they go to should depend on their abilities, or should everybody go to the same kind of school? The latter, of course, being an articulation of the principle of comprehensive education. Scotland is much more opposed to the idea of selection, of people going to different kinds of schools. What I'm showing you here, Scotland is very clearly behind the comprehensive principle in the way that in England, even after all these years, is still divided pretty much 50-50 on the principle as to whether or not you have selection at age 11 or not. So there are differences, but these are rare beasts to see these kinds of differences, and arguably this difference of attitudes towards comprehensive education is one of the few areas where there really is a clear, marked difference. Now, despite the differences in the delivery of public policy, and despite us being told that, therefore, of course, these are absolutely vital differences that are crucial to the quality and effectiveness of the National Health Service, I couldn't then avoid the temptation of also showing you this slide, which is when on a variety of occasions we've asked people on both sides of the border, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the National Health Service? So the health service may be delivered differently in Scotland, and indeed in Scotland may be delivered in a way that indeed is more consistent with the values that people hold so far as at least the kind of sectors that should be running the NHS. We may or may not be capable of meeting our targets north of the border. There may or may not be arguments south of the border about Andrew Lansley's reorganisation of the health service. But does any of it make any difference to our satisfaction with the institution? Apparently not. Okay, finally and briefly, in a somewhat slightly vein, the outside world. Do we have different views towards the outside world? Certainly there was a widespread presumption on both sides of the referendum campaign that we had a very different view of the outside world when it came to Europe. You'll remember the stories. You have to vote yes, because if you don't vote yes, you'll get yanked out of the European Union because the UK is going to vote to leave in a few years' time. You have to vote no, because if you vote for independence, the European Union will say, thou shalt not enter the pearly gates until you have paid so much you will no longer wish to join us. Both arguments presume that we were desperate to be members of the European Union, and definitely more desperate than those folk who are madly voting UKIP south of the border. Well, only up to a point, my lord. Again, this is a question that we've asked people on a fairly regular basis. It's a 5-point scale, and it goes from everything from we should get out of the European Union through to, well, I suppose we should remain an institution, but it'd be nice if Brussels bossed us around a lot, all the way around to those few folk who go, yeah, I want to sign up to be a European citizen, we want a single government tomorrow, thanks very much. Now, this is combining the people who say, want to get out, with those people who say, could Brussels boss us around rather less? And as you can see, those two groups constitute a majority of the public, both in the UK as a whole and in Scotland in particular. Scotland's a little more Europhile, it's a little less willing to take that view, but uncomfortable though it may be to admit, the modal Scot is a Cameronian on Europe. We probably have to stay in, but it would be nice if they bossed us around a little less. A second argument, of course, central to the beliefs of many of those on the yes side, was about nuclear weapons. And many claim that Scotland is clearly opposed to nuclear weapons, whereas the rest of the UK is willing to endorse them. Now, there certainly is a degree of truth to this argument. This is a very simple question, which is said to be whether or not do you think it's right or wrong for Britain to have its own nuclear weapons. So this was to do with the principle of holding nuclear weapons, not what should happen to the facility down at the end of the River Clyde. And as you can see, it is true, according to this question at least, that in Scotland the modal answer is that I think it's wrong to have nuclear weapons, whereas in England the modal answer is we should have them. But again, you'll notice these are differences of degree. This is frankly an issue on which both societies are seriously divided, on which there are strongly held views on both sides of the argument. In Scotland, yes, it is weighted slightly more towards the anti-nuclear weapons side. South of the border, it's slightly more weighted to the pro-nuclear weapons side. But the idea that these two societies have really starkly different views on the idea of nuclear weapons is clearly not correct. That said, and very briefly, one thing where perhaps, arguably Scotland is indeed rather more liberal and outgoing in its views towards the outside world, is that we're rather less likely to think that having more migrants from either Muslim origin from Eastern Europe or with a black and Asian background would constitute a threat to our identity. Even so, half of us still think it might be a bit of a threat, so don't imagine that Scotland is that liberal. All of this may be leaving you wondering, so how is it that Scotland's politics are so different? If indeed Scotland is only a little more left-wing, a little more liberal on welfare, or more liberal in its attitudes towards the outside world, how come the Conservative Party does so badly? The answer is simple. Even people on the right in Scotland do not vote for the Conservative Party in particularly large numbers. Here I'm going back to that old left-right scale I showed you right at the beginning. On the left-hand side are those people who kept on saying, yeah, absolutely, it's all terribly unequal and the government should do something about it. On the right-hand side are those folk who say, no, it's not too unequal. No, I don't think it's not too bad. And I certainly don't want the government doing anything about it. Now, south of the border, if you are of that disposition, clearly on the right, there was a 67% chance that you voted Conservative in 2010. North of the border, that chance is less than half. So the reason why our party politics are different is not because our values are different, at least in terms of the kinds of topics I've been looking at. They're a little different, but they're not dramatically different. It's that the Conservative Party is actually unable to reflect in its support the constituency for a rather more centre-right view of the world that does actually exist in Scotland, but at the moment remains rather ashamed to admit of its own existence. But one of the fascinating questions, arguably always about independence, but to which we will not know the answer, at least in the immediate future, as to whether or not if Scotland had become independent, we would have discovered it's a rather more centre-right country after all.
Thank you, John, and thank you for 3 terrific lectures there.